this is sort of how I got to this place of understanding what cultural competency meant, that we read it in a textbook, and I teach this course in our program, and I thinking, what are we going to learn about cultural competency from a textbook? Because we want to group people, right? This is the Asian chapter, and this is the African American chapter, and everybody lives in that chapter. So quickly I said, no, you got to get out and talk to people in the community. That's the only way that you're going to learn. So my background really has informed how I view urban students, but just also thinking holistically in a cultural way. So take a moment to read this quote. What is Nietzsche telling us? You are one of a kind, and there shall be anyone ever like you. That's pretty powerful. It's pretty powerful. And it says a lot about how we, again, think of groups of people, because that's how our brains work, to categorize. But how do I take the time to get to know Toria and say, who are you? What makes you you and different and unique from everybody else? And I think that's a beautiful thing, that our world exists in that way. So take a few minutes. Two lists. And this is sort of, think about your classes just ended. And I want you to make two lists. One list is your strengths and assets, and the other is your students' strengths and assets. Okay. I want you to hang on to that list, because we're going to come back to it later on in the presentation, but I want you to start thinking about strengths and assets. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on content, but I certainly want to revisit a little bit from yesterday, what is cultural competence. And this fits with a lot of, also in our counseling, we believe that in order for us as counselors to ever effectively help another person, you have to fully accept them without judgment. And that's not an easy thing to do. And it's not an easy thing to do because I'm a human being. I have my own values. I have my own beliefs. I was raised a certain way. And for me, it could be the right way, or it could just be my way. So we believe that in order to ever fully help a child, help a student, help a family, as much as they can get under your skin, or as much as they can seem resistant, all these things that we can find that don't fit with us, we've got to find a way to put it away. And what we do in our counseling programs is, it's funny because we get into admissions, and we tell students from day one that yes, you're in a counseling program because they're so eager to help others. I'm in this profession, right, to help others. But you can't help other people until you know who you are. And so they're like, well, when are we going to start doing, the counseling stuff? I'm like, you're already doing it. You're starting with yourself. And so it's very similar, right, in teaching, that you have to develop, we call it awareness, knowledge, and skills. And so when we think about awareness, knowledge, and skills, awareness is that, let's say, a group of people exists. We don't know too much about them. A lot of times my students say, I have an awareness of the Muslim population, but I don't know too much about them. So you have this awareness, and then how do you get to that knowledge piece? What are some strategies to get to knowledge? Ask questions, right? What else? Read? Anything else? Observe, right? So we want to find ways to find accurate information. That's really important in the knowledge piece, is that we don't get into the stereotypes, right? We want to confirm only what we're observing, what we're hearing from the people themselves, or what we're reading from research that say this is maybe some generalized ideas about this population, but you can never be too generalized. And then the idea is skills. So if I move away from just having an awareness to now having a real knowledge of this population, I can develop true skills and strategies that fit with the population. So again, I'm going to use my school counseling background. And so when I did work as a high school counselor for a number of years, and it was a very diverse school. I mean, very diverse. And I remember there was a lot of Hispanic students at our school. And when it got to talk about advising and course selection and what they were thinking about their futures, you know, they were very focused on their families and being close to their families. Now, if I come in and say, well, you have to do what's right for you, right? America is very what? Individualistic. You turn 18, you get out of the house, you make your own way. Hispanic culture is not like that. My culture is not like that. So that's very offensive for me to counsel someone based on my values, right? So if I'm not aware of the collectivist nature about a community, I can do more damage. That child can go home and say, my counselor said I can do what I want, and now I've caused friction in the family. So I'm sure in your communities, and most urban communities are very collectivist in nature. Think about who takes care of children in urban communities. Who? Grandmother? Aunts, uncles, neighbors, right? Very collectivist community, and we got to see that as assets, not that there's not a two-parent home. And so we have to, for me, is developing counseling strategies that align with that. And how many of you have ever heard of cultural encapsulation? Okay. What that is I have my own culture, okay, and I put my blinders on, and this is all I see. This is my worldview right here. I shall never expand it if I'm encapsulated in my own world. And so if we don't go through this process of even understanding where we are with our awareness, developing the knowledge, finding those skills, I'm going to continue to be culturally encapsulated in my practice. Does that make sense? Yeah. So when we talk about skills, it's nothing new, but it's in the intentional practice. I think that's what Crystal said, earlier, that you've got to be intentional about how we use our time, right? So we've got to be intentional in our practice. So the first one, valuing diversity, is just having an awareness, right, that diversity exists and being respectful of that. Again, because I'm a human being doesn't mean I may agree with people's choices or think that that's the best way to do things. But understanding that exists, and people have a different way of communicating traditions and values. So we've talked already about being self-aware. And yesterday, I believe Dr. Lewis, right? He was using culture and using that as lessons, right? He talked about lyrics and turning them into poetry, and that's essentially what this is saying, is how can you use those assets that exist and incorporate them into your lesson planning. And that takes time, right? It takes time for you to sit down and be focused in that way, rather than the reality of the world is that you only have so much time in the day. I mean, I know teachers, you barely get to go to the bathroom, right? So it's not as easy. It's not as easy as it is on paper. Knowing the dynamics of cultural interaction. So one of the things that we ought to think about are historical cultural experiences and cultures that exist in a community. So if you think about the community in which you work, and actually I think the very last day we're going to talk more about partnerships. But if you think about just in a cultural way, how do you think about your community in which you work in a cultural way? What cultural assets or values exist? So for example, at SA Hall, the community is very well aware of how the rest of Jacksonville views them. Every time there's something in the paper, it's about the North Side. Every time there's something about a failing school, it's about one of the North Side schools. So those are things that are front and center, right, in the media. But never shall anyone talk about what really happens in the community in terms of community organizations, church groups, people really coming together in the community to support each other. So again, another example is when I was working as a professor at UNF, University of North Florida, we had an after-school program in one of those feeder schools. So it was a high school. And actually, it was really cool. I went back years later and saw my elementary kids from S.A. Hall were there in the high school. I'm like, that's you! And it's just amazing to see them. But we were hearing in this after-school program, so this after-school program was just about college and career readiness, and also about giving post-secondary opportunities. So it didn't necessarily have to be a four-year institution. We didn't want to narrow anybody's choices, but also we wanted to have the choices wide open for students. What opportunities can we provide you? So we did everything from doing college fairs and career fairs and taking them to college campuses, and they got a lot of exposure. These kids are really motivated. I mean, they're high school kids staying after school to get more support. Most kids want to get home. So these kids, we were hearing from them a lot like, well, we know what everybody else thinks of us, but we believe better for ourselves. We know what everybody else says that we can't do because they see it in the news and they see it on the paper, but they want to narrate a different story. And so what we did was we started thinking about, the local community, what assets were in the local community. So example of that is when we started doing the career fairs in the middle school and high school, and we wanted to bring speakers in, where did we get the speakers from? The community. We wanted the kids to see themselves becoming dentists, becoming pilots, becoming nurses. Not somebody that they had never seen before or didn't have any connection to, but right in their communities. So does that help you think about how to find the assets that are in the communities, and students begin to see and create narratives, stories about themselves that are really positive rather than what just exists in the media, because the proof is right there in front of them. And they have been, I'd say we, because I'm still very connected to university, but they've been doing this work for 12 years. And so a couple years ago, I decided to do a research study with these kids who were after school, because we knew that they were staying, and we knew that they were getting something out of it, and we had this academic data, right? But personally, interpersonally, what were they getting from it? And what we found was relationships. They found that people cared. So our still counseling students would be assigned to these groups of students, and they would talk about how they really felt cared for, how they felt supported, how they could ask questions about going to college or careers, and somebody would show up the next week with the information, follow up. So those are the things that matter. We were talking about relationships. Adapting to diversity, and I think we've talked about that in a number of ways. Designing educational services. So culture does play a critical role in learning. So going back to Nietzsche, every child brings an individual culture. Yesterday, when Dr. Hancock was, there was a conversation about the names, right? And we were talking about names and how important they're. It's interesting how things can stick with an individual, and maybe you've had these experiences too, but I remember in the 9th grade, I mean, I don't have an easy name. It's Sagel, and the E or the A are in awkward places for people, because in my culture we say Sagel, and it works. So I remember in the 9th grade, which is very scary, right? You're starting high school for the first time, and my English teacher, and this is important to remember, she was an English teacher, and she's going down the roster and calling names, and she gets to my name, and she's like, Sage, how do you say your name? Sagel. And she just made this big to do about not being able to say my name. She said, you know what? I'm just not going to use your name. I'm just going to say, hey, you, if I need you. And do you think I ever raised my hand to ask a question? Because who wants to be called, hey, you? No. And she's an English teacher. The exact opposite experience is a 6th grade teacher that I had. Back then I had a British accent, and I can bring it back. If we want to liven things up a bit, I can do it. But she would call me to read, and I still have the accent. And I was so embarrassed because the kids would be like, say it again, and say it. You know, they would like, I wanted to get rid of it so fast. And she would call on me to read, and I would talk really slow, and so they couldn't hear me. And the kids were like, we can't hear her. We can't hear her. And she's like, oh, she's doing just great. I mean, she was like my favorite teacher of all time. My favorite teacher of all time. So when I went back to the high school, when I became a school counselor, her husband was an administrator. I was like, Miss Grant was my favorite teacher. Because she was thinking in this way. She was thinking, Sejal has a British accent. I can tell that she's embarrassed of it. But I'm going to support her. I'm going to still call on her, and I'm going to celebrate it. And when students make fun of her, I'm going to be her ally. How many kids do you have in your classes that are embarrassed of something? And that goes such a long way. Because I still remember that 6th grade teacher and what she did for me. And I still remember the 9th grade teacher and what she didn't do for me. And so kids remember, right? They remember their allies. And when your teachers are your allies, you will do anything for them. Yeah. When we do make a link between culture, and research tells us that when we do link culture between the knowledge and skills, we can see students wanting to achieve, wanting to participate, wanting to try. Because like you're Robin, your example, she could have got into a shell had you not reached out. We're going to talk more about this on the last day, but the connection between home and school, and already had some great examples this morning about how many of you are already doing that. I think one of the things that as a school counselor I used to really worry about was knowing, and how many of you seen this, where your parents or guardians are afraid to come to school because they're intimidated by the system, right? And so what are some ways to help sort of demystify the system? Maybe they themselves had a really bad experience in school and they just want to stay away. Maybe they didn't feel connected or accepted when they were young, right? Memories do stick with us, and those are reminders. So what do we do? What are some strategies that you do to say, you know what, my classroom is always warm and welcoming? Yeah. So when we think of multiculturalism, do you remember the days when you go to a diversity training, like, oh, another diversity training, right? We've all been there. Well, we've come a long way as to how we conceptualize multiculturalism, and we call now the postmodern view, right? Very foo-foo sounds, but it actually makes sense that it accepts the existence of multiple worldviews. Okay, when you think about having multiple worldviews for yourself, what do you come up with? Based on, let's say, your gender, your ethnicity, your ability, your age, right? There's multiple worldviews that exist based on your own lived experience. Embody social constructionism, and so what that means is we all make meaning in our social world. So our social world, it could be our community, it could be our families, it could be our classroom. We make meaning, right, from those kinds of things. And so if I feel that I belong, like Kareem's example, that I belong, when I can socially construct that for myself, there's more meaning, right? I can internalize that versus if no one ever welcomed me in that way, I will build a completely different worldview. I will construct a very different social concept of where I belong. Do you see the difference between the two? Behavior is contextualist in nature. Can you think of an example when one behavior in this situation is appropriate, but if you take the same behavior and you put it in another context, it's inappropriate? Yes, we're all in somebody else's system. We just figured it out. And I want to go 65 and a 55, but do I want a ticket? So it's not going to be Sagel centered, right? When I do get that ticket. So it's very true. And as elementary school counselor, I used to do classroom lessons on that about school rules, right? And home rules. Like, it's okay in your neighborhood to, do whatever you wanted to do. But at school, no, you can't call each other names and, tell your mama jokes, and you can't do that. That's not a school behavior. And so it is about teaching those skills. And, we'd like to think that everybody comes in a nice little neat package and they're ready to go. But we've all learned these skills. It's just that there are a variety of people in place to teach it. So it may be that they don't have the figure that they need in their home to teach it. So, does it become the school's responsibility to teach that? And my answer would be, yeah, I think so. Both and rather either or. So back in the diversity days, of the old diversity, it was just, everything was sort of black and white, right? There shall be any gray there. And so now it could be a both and perspective. I can be both Indian and American, right? I can be both Indian and not have an accent. Relational view of language. This is really important, and we'll get to some skills later on that you'll get to practice about using language to develop relationships. And it's not just language as we see in the context of communication verbally, but it's also our nonverbals. I love this quote. It's one of our texts that we use in our training, but multiculturalism is broad and inclusive. It allows us to look at how we are the same and how we are different at the very same time. So Cheryl, I could look at you, and if we had some time together, we could find things that we have very similarities. We have some similarities and things in common, and we could also find differences. But how can you do that with your children that come from different backgrounds and different communities and you? Or appearance-wise, right, on the surface, racially, might be the same, but may be very different. So it reminded me of to caution where I categorize people and assume what music people like to listen to, and all those kinds of assumptions that I can make in any day. This is just another way of how we look at different multiple worldviews. I like this because it shows us that we belong to a multitude of categories. And so again, I may be of an Indian ethnicity, but I'm very different from those who were born and raised in India. Very different, just because I was raised in a Western world. And I remember growing up, when it comes to thinking about multiculturalism and cultural diversity, and especially in the context of working in urban schools, what are some labels that are placed on your schools in particular? What can you think about? What are the emotional consequences of being tied to a school with those labels? And not just the emotional consequences for the children, but for you as an educator.